There are places on this earth that seem to hold their breath. Vast, silent landscapes where the wind carries stories and the snow keeps secrets. The Ural Mountains, the ancient spine that separates Europe from Asia, is one such place. In the winter of 1959, these mountains were not just a geographical feature. They were a symbol of the Soviet Union's rugged, untamable heart. A place for adventure, for testing one's mettle against the raw power of nature. And it was into this heart of white silence that 10 young, brilliant, and experienced hikers ventured, full of the vigor and optimism of youth. 9 of them would never return. And the story of how they died, scattered across a desolate mountainside under the most baffling of circumstances, would become one of the most enduring and terrifying enigmas of the 20th century. This is not just a story of a hiking trip gone wrong. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a historical mystery so profound, so layered with inexplicable details, that it continues to defy explanation, haunting the frozen slopes of a mountain the local Monsey people call Kholit Syakhl, the Dead Mountain. To understand the mystery, you must first understand the people. This was not a group of naive amateurs. They were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, all of them seasoned Grade 2 hikers, on the cusp of achieving the prestigious Grade 3 certification, the highest in the Soviet Union. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering student and an expert expedition leader. He was meticulous, respected, and he had assembled a team of his peers. Georgy Krivonischenko, a construction engineer who loved to play the mandolin, Yuri Doroshenko, a robust and cheerful student, Zinaida Kolmogorova, a talented radio engineer known for her strength and determination. There was Rustam Slobodin, Ludmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Alexander Kolevatov. The oldest member was Semyon Zolotaryov, a 38-year-old instructor with a mysterious past and tattoos that were unusual for the time, a man who had insisted on joining the expedition at the last minute. The 10th member, Yuri Yudin, would be the sole survivor, forced to turn back early in the journey due to a flare-up of chronic sciatica. It was a twist of fate that would save his life and condemn him to a lifetime of survivor's guilt and unanswered questions. The group's journals and photographs, recovered later, paint a picture not of impending doom, but of youthful exuberance. They show smiling faces, camaraderie, and the kind of rugged joy that comes from pushing your limits in the wild. They documented their journey by train, by truck, and finally on skis, heading towards their ultimate goal, Mount Otorten. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin said his goodbyes, watching his friends disappear into the swirling snow. "I wish you a good trip," he said. It was the last time he would see any of them alive. The group continued, their diaries chronicling the brutal but beautiful conditions. On February 1st, they began their ascent up the slopes of Kholit Syakhl. The weather, which had been difficult, was worsening. A powerful blizzard was moving in, with cyclonic winds and blinding snow, a phenomenon known as a boran. In his final diary entry, Dyatlov wrote of their slow progress. They made a critical decision. Instead of descending to a more sheltered, forested area for the night, they chose to make camp on the exposed, open slope of the mountain. It was an odd choice for such an experienced crew. Perhaps they wanted to practice camping in harsh conditions, or perhaps they simply lost their bearings in the disorienting whiteout. Whatever the reason, it was here, on this desolate incline, that they pitched their large canvas tent. And it was here that their story, as they knew it, came to a violent and incomprehensible end. Dyatlov had arranged to send a telegram on February 12th upon their return to civilization. When the 12th came and went with no word, no one was overly concerned. Delays were common in such expeditions. But as the days stretched into a week, then longer, alarm began to grow. On February 20th, a volunteer search and rescue operation was launched. On February 26th, a pilot spotted something from the air. A dark shape against the endless white. A search party on the ground was directed to the location. What they found was not a scene of a mere accident. It was the beginning of a profound and disturbing Russian mystery. The tent was half collapsed, buried in snow, but clearly visible. The first thing the rescuers noticed was the silence. There were no voices, no signs of life. The second thing they noticed was the state of the tent itself. It hadn't collapsed from the weight of snow alone. It had been sliced and ripped open, not from the outside, but from the inside. It was a desperate, frantic act, as if the occupants needed to escape by any means necessary, even if it meant cutting their only shelter to ribbons in the sub-zero Siberian wilderness. Inside, the scene was one of ordered chaos. Booths were lined up, warm clothes and supplies were neatly stacked, and a meal of sliced bacon was laid out, ready to be eaten. All of their equipment, their means of survival, was still there, but the people were gone. Leading away from the tent, down the slope towards a sparse patch of trees about a mile away, was a single set of tracks. 9 sets of footprints, some from bare feet, some in only socks, 1 or 2 in a single boot. They were not running in panic, scattering in every direction. The tracks showed them walking, deliberately, side by side, down into the deadly cold. What could possibly compel 9 experienced hikers to slash their way out of their only shelter and walk, underdressed, into a blizzard with temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius? This was the first, and perhaps most fundamental, question in a long list of unexplained events. The trail of footprints led the rescuers to the edge of the nearby woods. There, under a giant Siberian cedar tree, they made their first gruesome discovery. The remains of a small fire lay scattered on the snow. And next to it, the bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko. They were stripped down to their underwear. Their hands were burned and abraded, and the branches of the cedar tree above them were broken up to a height of 15 feet, suggesting one of them had frantically tried to climb it, perhaps to get a better view, or perhaps to escape from something on the ground. A short time later, 3 more bodies were found, spaced out between the cedar tree and the camp. It was Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. Their positions suggested they had been trying to return to the tent. They were better dressed than the first 2, but still woefully inadequate for the conditions. Slobodin had a small fracture in his skull, but the coroner ruled that all 3, like the 2 by the fire, had died of hypothermia. The official conclusion was simple: they had frozen to death. For a moment, it seemed like a tragic but understandable accident. They had become disoriented, fled the tent for some unknown reason, and succumbed to the elements. Case closed. But it wasn't closed. For members of the party were still missing. For 2 months, the search continued, hampered by the deep, shifting snow. Finally, on May 4th, as the spring thaw began to set in, the last 4 hikers were found. And what the rescuers discovered in the depths of a snowy ravine, buried under more than 10 feet of snow, shattered any notion of a simple accident. This discovery transformed the Dyatlov Pass incident from a tragedy into a terrifying enigma. Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, Alexander Kolevatov, and Semyon Zolotaryov were found huddled together. They were better dressed than the others, some even wearing items of clothing taken from their deceased comrades, a desperate act of survival. But it was their injuries that were truly shocking. Thibault-Brignoles had suffered a massive, crushing skull fracture. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had multiple broken ribs, injuries the medical examiner compared to the force generated by a major car crash. These were not the kind of injuries one sustains from a fall or from exposure. These were violent, internal traumas. And yet, bizarrely, their bodies showed almost no external signs of injury. No bruises, no soft tissue damage. It was as if they had been crushed by an immense, invisible pressure. And then there was the most grotesque detail of all. When the examiner looked at Lyudmila Dubinina, he found that her tongue, her eyes, and part of her lips were missing. Some have tried to explain this away as the work of scavengers or natural decomposition in the wet environment of the ravine, but the other bodies did not exhibit similar post-mortem damage. The case files simply noted the fact, offering no explanation. To top it all off, when the victim's clothing was tested, several items showed significant levels of radioactivity. Not high enough to be lethal on their own, but high enough to be anomalous, with no natural source in the area. The official Soviet investigation was abruptly closed just 3 weeks after the final bodies were found. The lead prosecutor, Lev Ivanov, concluded that the hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. The area was sealed off to the public for 3 years. The files were classified. And with that tantalizingly vague and deeply unsatisfying conclusion, the unsolved mystery of Dyatlov Pass was born, giving rise to decades of speculation and a host of theories, ranging from the rational to the terrifyingly strange. Let's examine the most prominent of these theories, starting with the one that is now, once again, the official explanation from the modern Russian government: an avalanche. The theory posits that a small, delayed slab avalanche struck the tent. The weight of the snow caused the initial injuries and trapped them inside, forcing them to cut their way out. The fear of a second, larger avalanche drove them to retreat to the treeline without stopping to grab their gear. The internal injuries of the final 4 are explained by them falling into the ravine and being crushed by the weight of the snow on top of them. On the surface, this sounds plausible. It's a natural force. But for investigators and enthusiasts who have studied the case for decades, the avalanche theory is riddled with holes. First, the tent was not fully buried, and the poles were still standing. The footprints leading away from it were calm and orderly, not the chaotic, scrambling tracks of people fleeing for their lives. Dyatlov was an expert. He would have known not to camp on a slope with even a moderate avalanche risk. The slope itself was only about 23 degrees, generally considered too shallow for a natural avalanche to occur. And while a fall into a ravine could cause injuries, could it really generate the specific, immense, crush force trauma seen on the victims, all without significant external bruising? And what about the radiation? Or the missing tongue? The avalanche theory, while neat, simply doesn't account for some of the most bizarre evidence. This leads us to the second major category of theories: a military cover-up. In 1959, the Cold War was at its peak, and the Ural Mountains were a hub of Soviet military and industrial activity, including secret weapons testing. This theory suggests the hikers unwittingly stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see. Another hiking group about 30 miles south of Dyatlov Pass reported seeing strange, bright orange spheres or orbs floating in the sky on the night of the incident. Could these have been flares, or something more sinister? Perhaps a parachute mine test, or a new type of concussive weapon that creates a pressure wave capable of inflicting massive internal damage without breaking the skin. This could explain the crush injuries and why the hikers fled their tent ordered out at gunpoint, or terrified by a nearby explosion. The radiation could be fallout from such a weapon. This theory is compelling because it fits the paranoid, secretive nature of the Soviet state. A secret test gone wrong, a military cleanup crew silencing witnesses. It feels like a plot from a Cold War spy novel. However, it too has problems. If the military was involved, why would they leave such a messy, puzzling scene? Why not simply make the bodies disappear, or stage a more convincing accident? Why allow them to walk a mile away from their tent and build a fire? The evidence of military involvement is purely circumstantial, fueled by the orange spheres and the background radiation, which some have argued could have come from Krivonischenko's previous work at a nuclear facility. Let's venture into a more esoteric, but scientifically grounded, possibility: infrasound. This theory centers on a weather phenomenon known as a Kármán vortex street. In specific wind conditions, air flowing over a dome-shaped mountain like Kolytsyakhl can create a series of spinning vortices that generate powerful, low-frequency sound waves. Infrasound, while inaudible to the human ear, infrasound can have profound physiological effects. At the right frequency, it can induce feelings of intense, irrational panic, dread, and nausea. It can make you feel a presence in the room when there is none. The theory is that the hikers were caught in one of these infrasound events. It drove them mad with a nameless, directionless terror, compelling them to flee the tent at all costs. It provides a chillingly elegant explanation for their initial, bizarre behavior. However, infrasound does not break ribs or crush skulls. It could explain why they left the tent, but not how they died in the ravine. It's a powerful piece of the puzzle, but not the entire picture. Of course, any historical mystery this strange will inevitably attract paranormal explanations. This is where we enter the realm of the truly unknown. The local Mansi people have legends about the area. Kholat Syakhl, or Dead Mountain, is tied to stories of 9 hunters who died there mysteriously, and they traditionally avoid the area. There are tales of spirits, or even the Menk, the Siberian equivalent of the Yeti or Sasquatch. In fact, one of the last photos on Krivonischenko's camera is a blurry, out-of-focus shot that, to some, appears to show a large, ape-like figure peering from behind a tree. Is it a double exposure? A trick of the light? Or a final, terrified snapshot of their attacker? This theory, while thrilling, suffers from a complete lack of verifiable evidence. And then there are the UFOs linked to the orange spheres seen in the sky. Did the hikers witness something not of this world? Did an extraterrestrial encounter lead to their deaths? It's an idea that has captivated many, explaining the bizarre injuries, the radiation, and the compelling force as an advanced, non-human technology. Like the Yeti theory, it's an explanation born from the failure of all others, a hypothesis that rushes in to fill the vacuum of the unknown. So where does that leave us? We are left where Lev Ivanov was in 1959, staring into an abyss of uncertainty. We have a set of facts that refuse to fit together into a single, coherent narrative. Each theory explains some pieces of the puzzle, but no single theory explains them all. An avalanche doesn't explain the orderly footprints or the specific injuries. A military weapon doesn't explain why the scene was left so chaotically. Infrasound explains the panic, but not the trauma. A paranormal encounter explains everything and nothing, relying on belief rather than evidence. Perhaps the truth is not one single theory, but a terrifying cascade of events. Imagine a powerful infrasound event, generated by the storm, floods the tent with irrational terror, causing the hikers to slash their way out into the blizzard. Disoriented and panicked, they make their way to the tree line. The first two, Doroshenko and Krivonischenko, desperately try to start a fire, but succumb to the cold. The next 3, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, attempt a heroic but futile return to the tent and collapse. The final 4, seeking better shelter, stumble into the ravine in the whiteout conditions. It is here that the second event occurs. Perhaps a small, localized slab avalanche, triggered by their movement, buries them under tons of snow, causing the horrific crush injuries. It's a sequence of terrible luck and natural phenomena, a perfect storm of disaster. This combination theory is perhaps the most logical, yet it still feels incomplete. It doesn't fully account for the missing tongue or the radiation. It leaves nagging questions unanswered. The Dyatlov Pass incident is more than just an unsolved mystery. It is a story that speaks to our deepest fears. The fear of the unknown, the fear of nature's indifference, and the fear that sometimes there are no simple answers. The 9 hikers on Kholat Syakhl were not just victims. They've become figures of myth, their final, terrifying hours forever frozen in time. Their story is a labyrinth with no exit, a question mark permanently etched onto the face of a cold, silent mountain. The files may have been reopened, new investigations launched, but the core of the mystery remains as impenetrable as it was in 1959. It is a stark reminder that even in our modern world of science and reason, there are some secrets the wilderness is not yet ready to give up. This is just one of countless stories lost to time or buried in classified archives. If you're drawn to these journeys into the unexplained and want to help piece together the fragments of our most perplexing historical events, consider subscribing and becoming part of this exploration. The most compelling question I can leave you with is this: what do you think happened on Dead Mountain? Let me know your theory in the comments below. Thank you for listening.